The rain on the Trans-Canada Highway east of Rivière-du-Loup doesn't fall so much as it hangs. A gray curtain that turns the asphalt into a mirror and makes the tree line disappear somewhere between the road and the sky. On a Tuesday morning in late October, when the temperature had dropped enough to make your breath visible, but not enough to turn the rain to snow, a 24-year-old mechanic named Felix Dumont was already 3 hours into his shift at Bouchard's garage, lying flat on a creeper under a '09 F-150 with a rusted exhaust manifold, listening to the sound of the storm outside and thinking about rent. The garage sat on the edge of a small service road that branched off the highway, one of those places that exists because truckers need it to exist. 2 bays, a compressor that rattled when it ran, fluorescent lighting that flickered in the cold. The owner, a man named Claude Bouchard, who everyone called Bouchard, came in 3 days a week now, ever since his hip replacement. The other 4 days, Felix ran the place himself. He didn't get paid extra for it. He knew better than to ask. He was 24, but people who didn't know him often guessed older. Not because he looked worn out. He didn't, but because of the way he held still. He had the kind of stillness that comes not from calm but from learning early. That motion cost energy you might not have to spare. His mother had raised him alone in a rented house in St. Antonin, working 2 jobs through most of his childhood, and Felix had grown up understanding that the space between what you need and what you have is a gap you close with your own hands or you don't close at all. He'd been fixing things since he was 11. Bikes at first, then small engines, then anything that came through. He dropped out of Sedge after 1 semester. Not because he couldn't do the work, but because the work at school felt like a detour from the work he already knew how to do. Bouchard had given him a job at 19 and kept him on because Felix was the kind of employee you keep. He was there when he was supposed to be there. He didn't cut corners, and he had a feel for machines that some people spend 40 years trying to develop and never quite get. He wasn't thinking about any of that on the morning this story begins. He was thinking about the exhaust manifold, and about whether the seal on the left front hub bearing was original equipment or an aftermarket replacement that would crack again in 6 months, and about the fact that his mother had called the night before to say the hot water tank in her house had started making a sound she described as like a dog trying to bark underwater. He slid out from under the truck when he heard the highway. Not the rain, the highway. Specifically, the sound of a motorcycle engine decelerating hard on wet pavement. A sound that any mechanic knows is different from normal deceleration. The kind of downshift that means something has gone wrong and the rider is trying to manage it rather than ride through it. Felix was on his feet and at the bay door before he'd consciously decided to move. The bike came off the highway onto the service road at a speed that was too fast for the conditions and too slow to be controlled. It was a Harley-Davidson Road King, dark blue, maybe a 2015, and it made it about 40 meters down the service road before the rear wheel lost purchase on the wet gravel and went sideways. The rider laid it down, not a crash. Exactly, more a controlled disaster. The kind where the person survives by deciding to fall rather than waiting for the fall to happen to them. The bike slid another 10 meters on its side and came to rest against the drainage ditch at the edge of the road. Felix was already running. The rider was a man in his late 50s, heavy-set with gray in his beard and a Hells Angels vest soaked through with rain. His name, Felix would learn later, was Walter Hébert, and he'd been riding for 37 years. He was sitting up by the time Felix reached him, which was a good sign, but his left arm was at an angle that wasn't right, and he had a gash above his right eyebrow that was bleeding freely down the side of his face. "Don't move your arm," Felix said. He crouched beside the man. "Can you tell me where else you're hurt?" Walter looked at him. He had the kind of eyes that have seen a lot and are used to assessing things quickly. "Hip," he said. "Maybe. Hard to know yet. Okay, my name's Felix. I'm going to get you out of the rain. Can you stand if I help you?" It took them 4 minutes to get Walter from the ditch to the garage. Felix supported him on the right side, kept the pace slow, talked him through it. He'd dealt with injured people before, not often, but enough. His neighbor had fallen off a ladder 2 years ago, and Felix had been the first one there. You learn what steadiness sounds like. You learn to put your own reactions somewhere else for a while, somewhere you can come back to later. He got Walter into the garage and onto the old vinyl bench along the back wall. He got a first aid kit. He called 911 and gave them a clear, unhurried account of the situation. 1 adult male, probable left arm fracture, possible hip injury, laceration to the right forehead, stable and conscious. He gave the address. He hung up and went back to Walter. "Ambulance is 12 minutes out," he said. "They're good in this county. You'll be looked after." Walter watched him clean the forehead wound and apply pressure with gauze from the first aid kit. He didn't make much sound. Men like Walter, men who have been riding motorcycles for 37 years, who have been in a chapter of the Hells Angels for 22 of those years, who have seen things happen on the road and in other contexts that most people only read about. They have a particular relationship with pain. They know it. They've made a kind of peace with it. "You didn't hesitate," Walter said after a while. "Pardon? When you saw me go down, you didn't stand there thinking about it." Felix kept the pressure on the gauze. Neither would anyone else. Walter's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. You'd be surprised. The ambulance came. Felix helped the paramedics transfer Walter onto the stretcher. He answered their questions, gave a clear account of what he'd witnessed, showed them the position of the bike and the approximate path of the slide. One of the paramedics, a young woman, said he'd done everything right. Felix nodded. He didn't particularly need the validation, but he noted it. He went back into the garage and looked at the F-150. He thought about calling his mother about the hot water tank. He thought about whether the seal on the hub bearing was original equipment. He went back to work. 3 days passed. Felix didn't think much about Walter Hébert during those 3 days. Or rather, he thought about him the way you think about any person you've encountered in a moment of acute need. Briefly, with a hope that things had turned out reasonably well, and then with attention returned to the things directly in front of you. The hub bearing turned out to be aftermarket. He replaced it with OEM. The F-150's owner, a man who drove it to a fish hatchery every morning, shook Felix's hand, said it was the best the truck had felt in years. Felix said he was glad. He meant it. On the 4th day, 2 motorcycles pulled into the service road in the late afternoon. The rain had stopped the day before, and the temperature had climbed back up to something that made the wet gravel steam a little where the afternoon sun hit it. Felix was at the workbench when he heard them. He came to the bay door. The 2 riders were both wearing Hell's Angels vests. One was a man in his 40s who Felix didn't recognize. The other was Walter Hébert, moving carefully, his left arm in a cast, with the specific, deliberate movement of a person managing pain they decided was manageable. They came into the garage. Walter introduced the other man as Gilles. No last name offered, none asked for. Gilles was compact and quiet, with a gray-shot beard and the kind of posture that suggests someone spent time in the military, though Felix never confirmed this and didn't ask. "How's the arm?" Felix said. "Broken in 2 places," Walter said. "Left ulna, they put a plate in." He looked around the garage with the evaluative look of a person who knows what a workspace says about the person who runs it. He seemed to take in the organization of the tools, the cleanliness of the floor, the fact that the job Felix had been working on was laid out with a clear logic. Parts in sequence, nothing scattered. "You did that job 3 days ago," Walter said. "You haven't billed me for it." Felix looked at him. "What job?" "First aid, use of your facility, the call to 911. Walter's expression was completely neutral. "You could bill for all of it. What do you charge per hour?" "I don't charge for that." "I know you don't. That's not what I asked." Felix considered this. 85 an hour is the shop rate. "And you spent?" "Gilles tells me the paramedics logged a 22-minute response window, which means you were with me for approximately 20 minutes before they arrived." "About that." Walter nodded once, as though confirming something he'd already decided. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and produced an envelope and set it on the workbench. Felix looked at the envelope but didn't pick it up. "That's not necessary," he said. "No," Walter agreed. "It's not, that's why it's there." Felix picked up the envelope. It was heavier than 20 minutes of shop rate. Significantly heavier. He set it back down. "I can't take this." "You can," Walter said. "The discussion we're about to have will explain why, if you're willing to hear it." The discussion took 40 minutes. Gilles stood near the bay door for most of it, watching the service road, not in a menacing way but in the habitual way of someone who has spent a lot of years being aware of the space around him. Walter sat on the vinyl bench. Felix sat on a shop stool and listened. What Walter told him was this. The Angels ran a network of informal support for mechanics across 3 provinces, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Ontario. Not a charity exactly, but a system. If a member's bike broke down in a remote area, if a prospect needed work done quickly and discreetly, if someone in the network had a mechanical problem that required actual expertise rather than just a guy with a socket set, they had a list. People they knew and trusted. People who had demonstrated, through their actual conduct rather than their words, what kind of person they were. "We've been looking for someone in this corridor for 2 years, Walter said. Rivière-du-Loup to Edmundston. It's a long stretch of highway and we don't have a reliable contact there. Someone who can be trusted. Someone who knows what they're doing." Felix listened. He didn't interrupt. "I'm not asking you to do anything illegal," Walter said. "I want to be direct about that. What I'm asking is whether you'd be willing to be available for members who need mechanical help in this area. You'd be paid at your standard rate cash for any work you do. No markup, no finder's fee, no obligation to us in any other capacity." He paused. "You'd also be protected informally. People in this area know who we are. If you had a problem with a customer, with a supplier, with someone giving you difficulty, you'd have people to call." Felix thought about this. He thought about Bouchard's hip and the fact that the garage was slowly getting quieter as fewer truckers stopped, because there were newer service centers on the highway now. He thought about his mother's hot water tank. He thought about the hub bearing he'd ordered in OEM, and the fact that the markup difference between OEM and aftermarket over the course of a year was the difference between a garage that paid for itself and a garage that was slowly being subsidized by his own wages. "I'd need to keep doing regular work," he said. "This can't be the only thing." "We'd never ask for exclusivity," Walter said. "What you do with your shop is your business, and if I'm asked to do something I'm not comfortable with, You say no. We're not a franchise. We're not running you. Walter looked at him steadily. We're asking whether we can trust you. If the answer is yes, the relationship works because it's mutual. If the answer is no, we shake hands and drive away. Felix looked at the envelope on the workbench. He thought about what it means to live in a place like this. East of the city, west of the Maritimes, in the corridor where the highway runs long, and the winters are serious, and the businesses that survive are the ones that found a reason to survive. He thought about the fact that he was 24 years old and already the most reliable person in a garage he didn't own, doing the work of a shop foreman at an employee's wage, with no particular plan for what came after. He thought about Walter going down on the wet gravel and the way the man had looked at him in the rain and what he'd said. You didn't hesitate. I'm not going to pretend I don't have questions, Felix said. Good, Walter said. Pretending you don't have questions would be the wrong answer. What followed was not immediate or dramatic. There was no ceremony, no handshake over a fire, no moment where the world split cleanly into before and after. Felix worked his next Tuesday the same as any other Tuesday. He finished the heat shield on a Dodge Caravan and replaced a clutch cable on an old Yamaha V-Star that a retired school teacher from Kakuna had been riding since 2003. He called his mother and arranged to go over on the weekend to look at the hot water tank. It was a sediment buildup. He flushed it out in 40 minutes and the noise stopped. What changed was quieter than a ceremony. It changed the way things that are structurally significant often change, not in a single moment, but in a series of small moments that you only recognize as a series when you look back. 3 weeks after his conversation with Walter, a writer came in on a Friday evening, an hour before Felix was going to close up. He was from the Rivière du Loup chapter, a younger man, mid-30s, who introduced himself only as Petit. His clutch master cylinder had cracked, and he'd lost hydraulic pressure in the clutch line somewhere between Témiscouata-sur-le-Lac and the service road. He'd limped the last 20 kilometers mostly in second gear. Felix looked at the bike, a Road Glide 2018, well-maintained, and confirmed the diagnosis in about 4 minutes. He had a compatible master cylinder in stock, not a perfect match but a reliable substitute that would hold until the rider could get the OEM part in the city. He did the job in 2 hours. Petit tried to pay him twice what the job was worth. Felix charged him the standard rate. Walter said you'd do that. Petit said, do what? Charge the right amount. Petit looked at him. There's a kind of guy who sees an opportunity and takes it. There's a kind of guy who doesn't. Walter says you're the second kind. Felix wiped his hands on a shop rag. He didn't respond to that because he didn't think it required a response. He was the second kind. It wasn't something he decided to be. It was just what he was. The way his hands were the way they were. The way he could hear an engine and know things about it that he couldn't entirely explain. Tell him the bike's running clean, Felix said. He should get the OEM cylinder in within the month. The substitute will hold, but don't push it past 10,000 kilometers. Petit nodded. He had the look of a person filing information carefully. He started the bike, listened to it for a moment, nodded again, and rode away. 6 months in, Felix had picked up 11 jobs from network referrals. Not all of them were members. Some were associates. Some were family members of members. One was a 68-year-old woman named Dorette, who was not affiliated with the Angels at all, but whose son-in-law was, and who had a 1987 Honda Shadow that she'd been trying to get running again since her husband died 3 years ago. Felix got the Shadow running in one afternoon. He charged her for parts only. When Walter heard about the Shadow, he called Felix directly. Dorette called me, Walter said. Okay, Felix said. She cried on the phone. Felix didn't say anything for a moment. The bike was in good shape, actually mostly just fuel system, some carb work. The wiring harness needed 2 splices. That's not why she cried, Walter said. Felix was quiet. She said you didn't make her feel stupid for not knowing what was wrong. She said you talked to her like she was a person. She is a person. There was a pause on the line. Then Walter said something Felix would think about later. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was specific in a way that meant Walter had thought carefully before saying it. The reason we were looking for someone in that corridor for 2 years, Walter said, is not because there aren't mechanics there. There are mechanics. The reason is because we were looking for someone like you, and those people are harder to find. Felix didn't know what to say to that. He said, I appreciate it, which was not a very interesting thing to say, but was true. The winter in that part of Quebec comes in stages. October is the warning. November is the negotiation. December is the statement of terms, and the terms are non-negotiable. By the time January arrived that year, Felix had insulated the gap under the garage's east bay door, bought a better space heater with part of the money from the envelope Walter had left in October, and developed a small but steady roster of network clients that kept the garage busy through the months when regular highway traffic dropped. He also, without ever having planned it, acquired something he hadn't had before. A network of people who would answer the phone. This is not a small thing. In the life of a person who has spent most of their years operating with a small margin, financially, socially, in terms of who they can call if something goes wrong, having people who will answer the phone is a structural change. Not because Felix used it often. He didn't. He was not the kind of person who asked for things easily, but knowing it was there changed something about how he stood in his own life, the way a good foundation changes something about a building, even before you look at anything built on top of it. In February, Bouchard came in on one of his 3 days and sat down in the office, a small room off the main bay with a desk and a monitor and a filing cabinet that had been jammed open since at least 2019, and told Felix that he was thinking about selling the garage. Felix sat across from him and listened. Bouchard was 67. His hip was better but not right. His wife wanted to move to Trois-Rivières to be closer to their daughter's family. The garage had been running in the black for most of the past year, which Bouchard acknowledged with the candor of someone who knows the reason for a change, even if he hasn't said so directly. He looked at Felix across the desk and said, "I wouldn't sell it to someone who would run it wrong." Felix understood what Bouchard was saying. "I don't have the capital," Felix said. "Banks have capital. Banks lend capital to people with collateral." Bouchard nodded slowly. "What would you use the garage for if it were yours?" Felix told him. He talked for about 10 minutes, about the highway corridor, about the gap in the market, about reliable specialty service for older bikes and commercial vehicles, about the network he'd built quietly over the past 8 months. He talked about it the way he talked about mechanical problems, specifically without drama in terms of what the actual situation was and what the actual solution looked like. Bouchard listened to all of it. Then he said, "Walter Hébert vouched for you." Felix looked at him. "He called me in November," Bouchard said. "He told me you were the kind of person who should own something, not just run something." Bouchard's expression was not sentimental. He was not a sentimental man, but there was something careful in it, the look of someone who has made a decision and is now saying it out loud. "I'm going to set the price at a number you can service on a 7-year note. I know a broker at Desjardins who does this kind of deal. If you want this, it's yours." Felix sat with that for a moment. He thought about the cold morning in October, and the sound of a motorcycle decelerating on wet pavement, and the 4 minutes it took to get a man with a broken arm out of a ditch and into shelter. He thought about the fact that none of those 4 minutes had felt like a calculation. He'd just done what the situation required because that was what you did, or should do, or at least what he believed you should do in the particular way. He'd believed things his whole life, not loudly, not with any expectation of return, but with the conviction of someone who thinks the world works better when people act on that principle, even when it costs them something. He thought about his mother, and about what it would mean to call her and say that he was buying the garage. "Okay," Felix said. He said it the way he said most things, plainly without performance, and Bouchard nodded, and that was that. The papers were signed in April on a Thursday morning in the office of the Desjardins broker in Rivière-du-Loup. Felix's mother came with him. She wore the gray blazer she wore to anything she considered important, and she sat very straight in the chair beside him and read every page of the document before he signed it, which took a while, and neither of them said anything about the fact that she was doing this. It was simply what she did. It was her way of being present. On the way back to the garage, his mother was quiet for most of the drive. Then she said, "This is because of that man you helped, the one in the rain." "Partly," Felix said. "But you would have helped him regardless." "Yes." She looked out the window at the highway. The asphalt was dry and the sky was the pale hard blue that southern Quebec gets in late April when the winter has finally released its claim. "That's the part that matters," she said, "not the outcome. The fact that it wasn't about the outcome." Felix drove. He thought she was right. He also thought that the outcome was real and that there was nothing wrong with being glad of it, that you could hold both things at once, the principle and the consequence, and that holding both was more honest than pretending the consequence didn't exist or that you hadn't noticed it. He pulled into the service road and parked behind the garage. He sat for a moment before getting out. Through the bay door, he could see the shape of a bike on the lift. A client coming in that afternoon, a road king with an oil leak someone had been tolerating for too long. He knew what the fix was. He'd known since the client described it on the phone. The pattern of the leak, the age of the gasket, the specific complaint about a slight burning smell at idle. He'd ordered the part already. It would take about 90 minutes. He got out of the car. He opened the bay door. He got to work.